Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Milo, Gibson and Laurence Fishburne star in the faith-based sports drama Under the Stadium Lights.
In 2009, the Abilene Eagles in Texas are trying to recover from a devastating defeat to the playoffs the previous year. The film focuses on the stories of several key players. Quarterback Ronell Sims, played by Carter Redwood, whose father, played by Eddie George, is struggling with drug addiction. Running back Herschel Sims, played by Acorye White, whose mother is sent to prison after violating her parole. And linebacker Augustin Brontes, played by Jermaine Arroyo, struggling to avoid being led into gangs and criminal life by his brother Zay, played by Nicholas Delgado. As they confine the team's chaplain, police officer Chad Mitchell, played by Milo Gibson, these key players try to overcome their hardships at home and turn them into victory on the gridiron.
Under the Stadium Lights is based on the book Brother's Keeper by Al Pickett and Chad Mitchell, the latter of whom is the person that Milo Gibson plays in the movie. The book is a fairly analytical, fairly statistical account of the coaching strategies they used that particular season, and the filmmakers interview the various players involved to incorporate their stories into the screenplay. As you'll no doubt be able to guess, the film was also shot under the title of Brother's Keeper, which is referenced numerous times both visually and in the dialogue, and even in the film's copyright notice. But presumably, when Saban Films acquired it, they retitled the film to make sure it was something closer to Friday Night Lights, and also to make clear that it was a sports movie. In the UK, we inexplicably got this 2 months early. For some reason, when it was released, there wasn't even a trailer, it was just dumped out on streaming services one day, presumably because Saban felt there was so little audience for this in the UK, they could literally just slip it out quietly and as quickly as possible. Now, the film is obviously trying to follow in the footsteps of fellow religious sports dramas like When the Game Stands Tall and Facing the Giants, although the tone of the movie is more closer to something like Gridiron Gang, but unfortunately, this doesn't score any touchdowns. Now, I was fully prepared to come out here and say the only people that would be interested in this movie are from Abilene, Texas, but it turns out that's not even true. You see, I found an article from late 2019 about how the producers held a big local event for the film's first screening, basically treating it like a pseudo-premiere. They rolled out the red carpet, flew some of the cast in, and treated it like a celebration of the city's greatest sporting glory, even though most of the film wasn't actually shot there, it was shot in Minnesota. And the local crowd hated it. Apparently social media was flooded with complaints, but the biggest feeling of all was that it was a poor depiction of the city. They felt it was depicted on screen as being some sort of crime-ridden slum, and they really didn't like the fact that the film didn't actually feel all that uplifting, even though it purported to be. So you have to imagine the producers suddenly going into panic stations, panic stations, panic stations. The place the movie is based upon hates it. And Under the Stadium Lights, the finished version of the film, basically feels like they spent the next year or so in an absolute frenzy trying to restructure the movie and trying to solve all of their problems. The thing is, though, editing can only fix so much. If you write a poor script in the first place, you can cut it as many ways as you like. You're still not going to cover up for the deficiencies that you started with in the first place. And that's what happens here. Under the Stadium Lights just exacerbates the problems that it probably already had in its initial version, because now this restructured version, however the original version was plotted, it definitely doesn't come across that way in the finished product, which just feels completely disjointed at best. So here is the structure of the released version of Under the Stadium Lights. As we come out of the opening credits, we move into a scene where the coach and Chad Mitchell are having a team meeting with the players, and Mitchell is trying to get them to confide in their various issues. And it looks to me like this was a scene that happened much later in the movie, and they've ripped it out and transplanted it at the front, and they've used it as the basis for this entirely reworked first act in editing. So they've just chopped it up and filleted it across the first half an hour of the movie, so that when each of the players comes up about their various problems, we cut to their individual storylines. Now, in theory this could work, but in practice it definitely doesn't. The first reason of which being that this scene that they've nested clearly was never written or shot in this way, so it feels very abrupt and has no logical flow to it whatsoever. And this doesn't just apply to this particular set of scenes, it applies to the whole new first act in general, because when we cut to these players' individual storylines, it looks to me like this was an ensemble film that cut between them at various intervals, and instead what the filmmakers have done is that they've just ripped those scenes out of wherever they were and smashed them together, so it's hideously jumpy now. The film's structure is incredibly erratic. It's clear that certain scenes happened after certain other events that we see later in the movie, and certain things were meant to go there, and it really doesn't work to just turn them into highlight reels of what they once were. It's clear that they were trying to make the movie more focused on the players, because one of the big major complaints is that it was too focused on Mitchell in the earlier version, but this is a very poor way of going about it, because whatever story the film is trying to tell becomes incredibly diluted and very just plain unclear. I was confused trying to watch the film. And worse, it doesn't really make you attach to each of the characters. And by taking these scenes out of their context and compiling them together like this, it reveals that the real problem is that these individual storylines just aren't that interesting on their own. They often feel very underwritten, and if I'm being perfectly honest, quite trite and cliched. Under the Stadium Lights feels like you're watching 3 after-school specials at once, one about drug addiction, another about a parent in prison, and another about being led into gangs. And I don't mean to be harsh to the young performers in this film who are clearly inexperienced, but that shows on screen. A lot of these scenes fall into melodramatic histrionics, especially the scenes with Buberantes and his brother that are really quite cringeworthy at times and very, very cheesy. They don't sell the emotion and the conflict that these characters are going through. The fact that you've got 2 storylines about absentee parents doesn't help. It feels quite repetitious on that level as well. But the main problem is that director Todd Randall, who has never made a film before, and boy is that evident, doesn't really have a clear sense of the tone that he's trying to make his film. This is meant to be an uplifting story, but the filmmakers have forgotten that part of the movie. So basically what happens is that you've got an hour of fairly depressing drama, followed by the big game, and then the movie stops. It doesn't have any closure or resolution to each of these individual storylines, and I'm not trying to imply they should have it so that the big game solves everyone's problems, because that's not how life works, but you would hope that the movie ends in some kind of upbeat way that implies that things are going to improve and change in each of these individual players' lives. And it doesn't even bother to do that part. And these tonal problems were clearly a major reason why the local audience in Abilene rejected the film. As I mentioned earlier, it seemed like the earlier cut of the film focused more on Mitchell and his day duties as a cop. The article I read mentions how the film originally opened with a sequence where Mitchell is called out to a scene where someone is dousing their girlfriend in gasoline, threatening to set them on fire. And I can understand why the audience was perplexed, because why is this the way you open your sports movie? And I can tell you now that in the final version of the film, no such sequence exists. They clearly deleted the entire thing, and with good reason, because it has no place in this movie whatsoever. And I think they were trying to make Mitchell the kind of structure around which the movie's based. He's the glue that holds the team together and the movie itself. And instead, he's barely even in the first 30 minutes of this film. And so a lot of Milo Gibson's material appears to have been left on the cutting room floor. Gibson, who is of course the son of Mel, is fine, I guess. He's quite bland here, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that his role is really not interesting at all. He serves as something of a confidant to the players, and his little mini storyline is that his wife is having problems with him because he's spending more time with his players than he is his family. Basically, you're just being too kind and generous of a person. What a problem to have! The other storyline that he has in this movie is that he's trying to reform a gang member played by Noel G and lead him into a path of religion. And again, this is a sort of redemptive storyline. You would think that this is meant to be a hopeful part of the story, but actually it ends in a fairly bleak way, which ends up unintentionally giving the message that actually his fate was inescapable, that once he made his original decisions, he simply couldn't extricate himself from that life, which I don't think is the message the film is trying to convey. But perhaps the biggest name in the movie is buried deep into its cast list. Getting just 13th billing is Laurence Fishburne, of all people, playing Harold Christian. And if you lived in Abilene, Texas, you knew who this guy was. He was a former Eagles player that opened a barbecue wings restaurant in the city, somewhere where the Eagles members would regularly come and hang out, and they'd eat his wings and listen to his stories. He was a larger-than-life, gregarious figure that they clearly wanted to commemorate on film, and Fishburne comes in as by far the biggest person in this movie, and he is clearly having fun, he's clearly enjoying himself. I don't know how Fishburne ended up in this movie or why, but he definitely suits this role very well. The problem is that he's not given very much to do. In fact, Christian is so peripheral and so uninvolved with the other storylines of this movie that basically the entire role could be edited out and it really wouldn't make any difference to the movie at all. And that's a real shame, even though Christian has his own storyline where his health is deteriorating and he has a heart attack and he spends the rest of the movie in a hospital bed. It's a role that very much doesn't ask a lot of Fishburne, and he clearly shot this in a couple of days, but they really should have made Christian a much more central figure in the film, almost like a mentor to the Eagles and a confidant to Mitchell, someone for him to look up to and to talk to, so that when he starts having health problems, it really starts to be felt by the audience. You cement those emotional connections, and instead, the movie hopes for the goodwill that the audience won't have, because unless we lived in Abilene, Texas, we don't know who this guy is. Now, this is the part of the review where I talk about how this is a religious film, and I want to make clear that just because this is a Christian movie, that doesn't necessarily make it bad in of itself. There are a lot of purportedly Christian films that actually use religion as a way of peddling hatred and intolerance, and Under the Stadium Lights is not one of those films. It tries to promote values of looking out for each other, be your brother's keeper, look after your neighbour, and also of kindness and generosity and the ability to change and redeem oneself. All good Christian values that you would hope to see in a movie like this. I feel like a lot of faith-based fare get some sometimes deserved stick for the fact that they have quite poor filmmaking mixed with sometimes very questionable messaging, and Under the Stadium Lights mostly falls victim to the former. It is a Christian movie, it's just not a good example of what those could be. It is very clear that it is a religious film. It isn't trying to hide it. You've got close-ups of Bibles. Brother's Keeper is, of course, frequently mentioned over the course of the film, and you can especially see that at the very end of the film, where they have a direct call to action, which is very common in these kind of films, almost like it's a kind of sermon. At the end of the movie, you got this on-screen text that tells you to spread the message to your friends and family, hashtag Brother's Keeper, and that clearly signifies this was intended for church groups, the kind of people that would block book cinemas and then bus people out there under regular circumstances, of course, and then they would tweet and text this to all their friends and family. And this really doesn't work because, first of all, that's not the title of the movie anymore, so if you were hoping for viral marketing that way, doesn't really work. And second, exactly what the recipients of these messages meant to interpret? Brother's Keeper? Have they been watching another religious movie again? I suppose it's better than the time they told me that God's not dead. So you're probably wondering to yourself, why hasn't he talked about the sports in this sports drama? And the answer is, there really isn't that much to talk about. Now, the amount of stuff that I know about American football could probably fit on the back of a postage stamp, but that's not a problem here, because there's very little football in this football movie. I know, right? It turns out the filmmakers had such a low budget that they couldn't even film their own football sequences for the most part. And so what they do is they use archived television footage of the real life games. That's what you're watching for the majority of the movie. Crummy, blown up, pixelated SD video. And yes, to some extent, it is cool that they got real-life footage of the games, but this should be supplementing specially shot footage, not replacing it entirely. The whole reason why people watch football movies is they want to feel like they're on the gridiron. They want to feel like they're running across the grass with the crowd chanting behind them and the excitement and the adrenaline pumping. And as a sports drama, you should be putting the drama into the sports, so that if the characters are having a rough time off the gridiron, that should be reflected in their performance on it, which obviously you can't do if you're using archive footage. And so having that psychology and the emotions reflected in the way the games is played is crucially missed. The only time the movie actually has specially shot footage for the games is at the very end of the movie, and even the majority of that is largely archive footage. It's a couple of B-roll shots spliced in between. This is such a fundamental shortcoming that I can't even believe they thought it was releasable in this state. Imagine Rocky if it didn't have any boxing footage in it. And frankly, it's a bit of an insult to sports fans who have signed up to watch this movie, and then they get something that they could have turned on their televisions to see. Unless you're a die-hard fan of high school football, I can't recommend Under the Stadium Lights. It's a sports drama that barely has any sports in it and doesn't function as drama. It's badly directed, poorly shot, and ineptly structured. It's pretty clear they started out with a weak script, but in trying to fix things in post, they've only made things so much worse. The only redeeming values is Laurence Fishburne in a very brief supporting role, and the fact that it has good Christian values, which frankly should be the baseline for a faith-based movie. But really, the fact this has no football footage in it means it's worthless to its target audience, because there are so many better examples of this kind of film. Why would you even bother watching a movie that didn't have what you came to see in the first place? And that just makes this a very dull experience indeed. In fact, the movie is so punishingly overlong that it even has overinflated credits. It feels like the closing captions will never end, including the fact that it has an entire speech that was uttered in dialogue earlier in the movie. Why does it need to be displayed at the end of the movie? But the really funny thing that happens in the credits is that for some reason they've included the coach's opinions of the entire 2009 Abilene Eagles team. I don't know who that's for in particular, but it's just very funny to see comments like "can block in their flip-flops." Although my personal favourite was just the several people where it just said underrated. What does that mean? Oh, some people thought they were poor and didn't really contribute very much to the team, but they were good. because they were on a great team. Yeah, underrated is not a word that's going to be associated with this movie. If you like this review, then you can buy me a barbecue wing over at my Ko-fi page, or you can help me keep the faith over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.